Because it's so tempting to use sequencers to create melodies, it's easy to forget there are great modulation tools as well. In fact, any sequential voltage source is. It doesn't matter if the signal is quantized or if a sequencer's output is called pitch or 1 volt per octave. They can all be used to modulate other parameters in your patch and do anything from simple modulation to crunchy rhythmic sound design, sound character progression, and complex triggered movement. If you like to support my videos or you want to get access to PDF sheets with hundreds of patch ideas I used in my videos, have a look at my Patreon. But now, let's dive right in. Just using a simple sequence to modulate parameters directly is already a powerful trick. A modulation sequencer allows you to set a value for a parameter on each step of a sequence. If you use two sequencers with different lengths, one for the melody and one for the modulation movement can shift relative to the melodic sequence, which creates very interesting results. Here's a simple dual oscillator voice with mixer, low-pass filter and VCA. A regular sequencer is used to create a melody and trigger an envelope opening the filter and VCA. The clock of the main sequencer is used to drive another melodic RCV sequencer used as modulation source. It can modulate things in the voice directly, like the VCA, filter or pitch of the second oscillator. In this video, often multiple options are shown in the same patch, but you can pick one at a time. Just make sure the inputs have attenuators so you can dial in a subtle amount of modulation. Filter modulation leads to nice accent shifting. VCA modulation to per step volume control, and oscillator FM to per step oscillator drift. Beside modulating parameters in the voice itself, you can modulate parameters on modulators. For example, the speed of an LFO modulating the filter, or the decay of an envelope opening the filter and VCA. In this video I mostly stick to simple ingredients, but of course any module in a voice can be modulated. Here the simple voice is extended with a wavefolder and stereo delay. Modulating the FM of one of the oscillators is great when mixed and folded afterwards. But you can modulate parameters like the fold or symmetry on the wavefolder, or things like delay time and feedback amount on effects as well to explore unique sounds. Even though in many cases modulating a single parameter is enough to add depth, you can mix and match multiple destinations. Here's the basic voice again, but this time the modulation sequence is sent to both the oscillator pitch and the envelope decay. This results in longer notes when there is more oscillator drift. When combining multiple destinations, it can be useful to add inverters to create an inverse effect, for example to modulate a filter. In this setup, that makes longer drifting notes more muted to balance the sound. Beside direct modulation, you can add VCAs to the setup and control modulation depth. Here's the basic dual oscillator voice again. This time though, the envelope isn't modulating the filter in VCA directly, but it's sent through a VCA first. Now the modulation sequence can be used to modulate that VCA and control the depth the envelope is modulating the filter in VCA. This creates nice accent shifts. Here's another example with the same voice. This time an LFO is sent through a VCA before modulating the filter. The modulation sequence is used to modulate that VCA, controlling the depth of modulation. Of course, you can combine indirect with direct modulation. Here, a copy of the modulation sequence is inverted and modulating the frequency of the LFO. This means an increased modulation depth results in a slower LFO. Controlling modulation depth is also great with audio rate signals. Here's the same voice again with added modulation sequencer. You can send a copy of one of the oscillator's direct waveforms through a VCA and on to modulate the filter. Another classic example is using noise through a VCA to modulate the frequency of an oscillator. Modulating the CV inputs of either or both VCAs controls the depth of audio rate modulation per step. This really influences the character of the sound. This is interesting with more classic tonal FM tricks as well. Here's the same dual oscillator voice, but this time the second oscillator is sent through a VCA and used to modulate the pitch of the first oscillator. The sequencer is used to control the modulation depth. A copy of the modulating oscillator can still be used as audio and mixed with the main oscillator. Another example is using a tuned or untuned oscillator or audio rate LFO to modulate the VCA of the voice. Again through another VCA, so the sequencer can control the depth. This is called amplitude modulation, which I explained with a lot more depth in this older video if you'd like to learn more. When you add a few modular tools to the setup, the options expand quickly. For example, adding a clock divider to the setup adds a lot of variety to this concept, and this can work in two directions. Here's a patch from the previous chapter, with a modulation sequencer controlling the amount of modulation from oscillator to filter and from noise to oscillator pitch. In this case, however, the modulation sequencer is used as the master clock. The clock is sent through a divider and used to sync the melodic sequencer at a slower rate. The result is multiple modulation steps within each melodic step. Of course, this can be done the other way around as well. Here's a patch used in the first chapter with the modulation sequencer modulating the oscillator pitch, envelope decay and filter all at the same time. The melodic sequencer is used as the master clock and the modulation sequencer running at a slow division. This holds the modulation for multiple melodic steps before it's changing. Instead of just using stepped voltages, you can send a modulation sequence through a slew limiter to slope the edges. This can be used to avoid clicking sounds when modulating a filter or VCA, but also to create a sliding delayed effect. But slewed voltages can also be used to create interesting looping shapes. Here's the patch with FM through a VCA from second oscillator to the first, and AM from an untuned oscillator through a VCA to the voices VCA. The modulation sequencer is the master clock and the melodic sequencer is running at a slower division. The modulation sequence is sent through a slew limiter before modulating both VCAs. Because there are a few modulation steps within each melodic step, this creates a tempo-synced complex LFO-like effect. It's always worth exploring different speeds and divisions in setups like this. In order to add more length or variation to the modulation sequence, you can explore any inputs a sequencer might have, like a reset, start-stop or sequence direction inputs. In a patch with a clock divider, you can simply take one or multiple slower divisions to modulate the sequencer. But another interesting trick is using the gate or trigger output of the melodic sequencer, for example on the reset input. With a slow sequence and interesting patterns, this leads to a repeated modulation sequence, restarting on every new note. Modulation sequences can also be used to great effect for signal routing. Here's the basic voice with modulation sequencer used to control a panner. The input of the panner is a fast LFO and the two outputs of the panner are sent to modulate the filter frequency and end of chain VCA. The sequencer sets the modulation distribution on each step. In a similar way, you can modulate other utility tools like crossfaders or switches. Have a look at these videos if you'd like to learn more about those modules. I also made a video on how to make things like panners or crossfaders with regular VCAs. But there's one more fun thing I want to show you. Here's the basic voice, modulation sequence and panner. Just like modulation signals, you can pan audio signals into different paths. Here, the dry voice is sent to the input of the panner and the outputs of the panner are sent to two different effects. The modulation sequence can now select to which effect the audio is routed. Once you get the hang of using a sequencer for modulation, there are tons of variations. If you have favorite tricks, let me know about them in the comments. If you'd like to learn more, have a look here, and as always, smash that like, subscribe and bell button if you want to see more modular content from me. But that's it for now, thanks for watching and see you next time.